So welcome everyone. This is a webinar on dependence and autonomy. My name's Kate Colvin and I'm the CEO of Homelessness Australia. Before I go any further, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm joining from Wurundjeri country in the Kulin Nation and pay respect to elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to any Aboriginal people joining the discussion today. And also acknowledge that this land was never ceded, so it always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So many of you will know Homelessness Australia, but if you don't, we're the national peak body for homelessness. And our work is focused on achieving the changes needed to end homelessness. We're focused particularly on advocacy to the federal government, but also host the Housing First Train the Trainer program. And I'm going to post some links in the chat so you can find out more about Homelessness Australia. I'll do that in a minute. You're also welcome to become a member of Homelessness Australia, whether you're representing an organisation or whether you would like to join as an individual. Membership is free and it means you just never miss out on any of the news about homelessness policy or practice. So today we're going to discuss an important issue in homelessness, which is the question about how services can be delivered while putting dignity at the heart of homelessness support. And the idea for this discussion came up when I was reading Cameron Parcells' book on new book, surprisingly called Homelessness, which explores client experiences of being a person who relies on homelessness services. So I think this is something that's really critical for us to discuss now, because as the pressure on homelessness services increases, one of the ways that's used to manage demand is sometimes coercive practices. So, for example, people are only able to often stay in crisis accommodation if they can demonstrate that they're really actively looking for rental accommodation, and again then have to accept any offers of rental accommodation they get, even if they feel like it doesn't meet their needs. And often then sometimes there's more subtle ways of coercion where there's so much pressure on emergency accommodation that people are really strongly encouraged to return to family, even if perhaps they don't feel safe, or to take other offers of accommodation that might not meet their needs. So on the one hand, we can see that these forms of coercion are really inconsistent with the Housing First principle about choice and self-determination. But on the other hand, they're a result partly of a housing market context and an adequate level of resources for homelessness services that homelessness services can't control. So it's the balance of these issues that we want to explore today, particularly hearing of what client experiences of homelessness, accessing homelessness services are. And to explore these issues, we've partnered with our wonderful colleagues at Council to Homeless Persons. A big shout out to all the Council to Homeless Persons colleagues on the call, and their peer education support program. So we're joined by PEST graduates Amanda and Chris, who are going to reflect on Cameron's research and their own experience. So first, I'm going to introduce Cameron to share his research with you, and then we'll have a reflective discussion with Christine and Amanda, and then open up to you all to engage. So I would particularly encourage, if you have your own lived experience of homelessness, to really share what your thoughts are about this topic when we get to that open discussion section. Really love to hear from you, but of course everyone's really welcome to engage. So can I introduce Professor Cameron Parcells? He's Professor of Social Sciences at the University of Queensland and an Australian Research Council Industry Fellow. And Cameron's research focuses on the nature and experience of poverty, homelessness, and domestic and family violence, and what needs to happen to achieve the systems change to end homelessness. So Cameron, over to you.
Thank you very much, Kate. Thanks for the introduction, and thank you to Homelessness Australia for hosting this. I'm very pleased to be able to talk about my some findings from my recent book today, and I'd like to start off by acknowledging that I'm on Turrbal and Yagara country in the Brisbane Valley, and I acknowledge traditional custodians I'm also very keen to hear after I chat for 15 or 20 or so minutes from Chris and Amanda, who I know are really kind of innovating in this space and helping us understand not just the nature of homelessness, but what needs to be done from a perspective that is both profoundly deep and compelling. I'm just going to share my screen, and we're going well. We've got there. This idea of autonomy and dependence is an idea that's really interesting to me, and it's interesting to me from the perspective that I'm interested at the high level in what are the societal changes required to end homelessness, and I'm very much thinking about those broad systems level changes, and I think we can't move away. We can't move toward progressing those changes unless we understand not only the experience of being homeless, but the experience that's kind of produced through the system that people who are homeless have to endure and experience. So this study is trying to generate the knowledge and the evidence, often from the perspectives of people with lived experience, to try and change those broader systems. And I think one of the greatest reasons that we can argue for the systems change where all people have a right to housing of their own choosing is because of the impacts that homelessness has. And some of those impacts are around health and around safety, but there are also others that are less well recognized around dependence and undermining people's autonomy. And there's some of the things that we're going to talk about today. And when I'm talking with people in the world who are not necessarily interested in or embedded in the homelessness or social policy or welfare or social work world, they kind of work from a premise that I think is important to note and then important to challenge. And that is, they say to me, Cameron, well, people who are homeless, they have nothing. That's what they assume. So anything we give them is okay. This is kind of the argument that's put forward to me. You know, they don't have a bed and we all need a bed. So if we provide beds in a car park, that's better than nothing, they will say. And of course, Cameron, you appreciate the hygiene that you have. So any type of means we engage in to try and provide hygiene to people who are homeless is okay because they have nothing. Or they don't have a kitchen or the means to cook for themselves. So anything we do to meet their nutrition is okay, the argument goes. And it's kind of very much focusing on the perspectives of assuming that we've met the needs of people who are homeless without actually taking into account their experiences or reality. And there's a very, very famous and brilliant feminist scholar of care called Joan Tronto from North America. And she reminds us that we can only ever really determine the worth of care or the ethicality of care, not by asking the caregiver or assuming that care has been done because we've observed it, but rather by taking into account and deeply engaging with people on the receiving end. We need to understand what their experiences are before we can determine whether care has been given, not just assuming that a need's been met. And this idea of autonomy comes up again and again and again. And autonomy is really important in this space. And it's important in this space because autonomy, this idea that we can choose what we want to do in life, importantly, choose what we don't want to do, is a precondition to living a good life. Now, it doesn't mean that having autonomy is a guarantee of a good life, but we need to be able to be in a position to exercise autonomy, exercise control over what we're doing in order to have the kind of life that many of us would regard as meaningful. But very, very importantly, autonomy is not about the individual. We have to think about autonomy as relational and as within the environment. We have to think about, very, very importantly, in the context of homelessness and housing deprivation, whether the environment that people are in actually enables expressions of autonomy or whether it constrains it. And this is important. So we always have to think about autonomy, the way that people can or cannot exercise control over their lives, something very, very individual. But we have to think about that at the kind of the societal level. And that automatically forces us to think about it at the political level. What are the resources available? And there's another fantastic scholar, Iris Marion Young, and she talks about this idea of interdependent lives. Now, we sometimes hear politicians talk about the importance of being independent and not being dependent on the state. And this is kind of deeply problematic. What we know is that a flourishing life, a good life, is where we're interdependent. And that means sometimes we're reliant upon the care of others. In fact, often that can be a really good thing. But interdependencies mean that we can also provide care to others. It means that when we're kind of living within a network of resources that we rely upon to access from other people, but we're also enabled through the resources we have to provide care and support to others as well. And this is kind of another word for this might be community, or flourishing within a network of people. So we have to think about the way that the resource deprivation of homelessness takes away the capacity for people to be able to live in these interdependent lives, and of course to practice reciprocal care, where they're not only the care receiver but can also be the caregiver. Now, this is the absolute core point from today, and I think this is the most important point, and that is that by excluding an individual from their own housing, we kind of force them into a position where they become reliant or dependent upon others to meet their basic need. So homelessness is not just the state of being without a house, it also forces people to live in a certain kind of way. And that kind of way is about being reliant on other, and it can kind of challenge the capacity for people to exercise autonomy over their lives. And this is an important way to frame it in terms of by withholding housing from people, we force them into these relationships, because it very much puts the focus on the problem here is the lack of housing. And this is important because even though what I'm going to talk about from the research suggests that the services, professional and voluntary services, sometimes undermine autonomy, almost very, very, very rarely is that because of the professionals or the volunteers themselves. Rather, it's the structured relationship, the way that not having a home of one's own makes people reliant upon others for basic needs around washing, eating, safety, and sleeping. So it's really putting the focus on what are the resource deficiencies within the system rather than what are the problems with the people working in the system. Because very often, if we're trying to find the problems, it's not about those working in the system. It is about the kind of the system and the lack of affordable housing that they have to operate within. So what does the research say? First, I'm going to touch on charity. And what we know about charity is, and I'm not talking about charitable organizations that provide professional services. I'm talking about voluntary charity, which is people donating their time or resources or money to people in a kind of voluntary sense. And we know that this is not only an important resource in the lives of people homeless, but it's growing. The necessity of people to rely upon food from voluntary care and a range of other voluntary services actually increasing over the years, and certainly since COVID. Now, if we look at the media, charity toward people who are homeless is absolutely fabulous. We award people providing charity with prestigious awards. They're provided with significant grants, and they're seen by politicians and our leaders in society as the embodiment of the care society. You know, it's wonderful. And of course, those individuals who are going out there and doing that, I think that can be a great expression of care and solidarity and concern for others. But I want to focus a little bit on the perspectives of people who are homeless and how do they experience receiving care and help from volunteers. And what I learned in field research, where I'm going out onto the streets and spending a lot of time where this is happening, is something very, very nuanced. And I learned something very powerful from people. And they said, Cameron, I absolutely respect the volunteers that come out here and try and help me. They could be sitting on their couch doing nothing, but instead they're volunteering their time to come and help me get a feed or just have some companionship. And I respect them for doing that. But gosh, the feeling of having to rely on this charity really undermines who I am. So they make this important distinction, and it's a very, 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 very clever distinction that they help me understand. And that is the people who are out there, I kind of cannot speak highly enough about them, but the way that having to rely upon these people, for example, to access coffee or food or a bathroom really undermines my sense of self as a capable person. From the United States, we also see, and we're hearing about this in some contexts in Australia, certainly not all, but in some, this idea that in order to access charity, we'll kind of have our autonomy constrained, because if I want to have that food that I desperately need, I need to participate in a sermon. I need to sit there and first sit through a service, and once I've sat through the service, then I'll be able to access the food. And the research shows that even people who identify strongly as Christians and who want to go to a sermon They don't like the way that it's conditional. This idea that I can only access food that I desperately need, or a shower or the toilet that I desperately need, if I'm going to give something that I don't want to do. Again, it gets to this point of not being able to control what one's doing in life. Again, even though they don't necessarily have a problem with religion or the sermon, it's just the conditionality that people feel is a real challenge. But what about professional homelessness services, in particular homelessness accommodation? Well, what we know from the literature, sadly, is that some homelessness accommodation here in Australia and also overseas, people who are homeless see as so problematic that they'll actually choose, I use the term choose provocatively, to sleep on the streets rather than homeless accommodation. Now, that's not all homeless accommodation, of course. Homeless accommodation, if it's responding to a crisis, can be exactly what people need. But a lot of the research is demonstrating that some models of homeless accommodation actually take away people's autonomy. They take away people's autonomy by monitoring them coming in and out of the building, monitoring what they do in the building, determining when they can stay in the building, leaving in the morning, for example, coming back in the afternoon. They feel that they are judged. And this is particularly the case for people who are in homeless accommodation who have dependent children. What the research shows is that those parents feel like their parental authority and capacity is taken away, and it's handed over to the authority of the organisation or the management of the homeless care accommodation provider. This idea of having room checks, of the parent having to comply with certain conditions, they see this as embarrassing and shameful in front of their children, and it undermines their legitimacy. Also, the questioning about whether people are applying for a job or applying for the right type of housing that Kate mentioned earlier. People see this as kind of an absolute threat to their legitimacy to be able to choose how they want to live themselves. And what we see is very, very important here is that we've done lots of research with service providers. And often they will say, well, you know, we get a lot of pressure from the state that funds us to get people through the homeless accommodation. We know that they've got nowhere to go. So we kind of almost feel pressured to kind of be pushing people through in a way that they don't want to be pushed through and going to outcomes that they don't want to achieve. So there's a lot of pressure within the system. So it's about not looking necessarily at the service providers and lamenting them, but rather looking at the broader resource deficiencies within the structure of society. And of course, resource deficiencies, another word for that is lack of affordable housing that kind of promotes the conditions for this kind of monitoring and judgment and shaming. But we also see too that the realities of there's still some today, homeless accommodation where people have to sleep in dormitories or share kitchens with people they don't know, share communal areas with people they don't know. This is a very, very complicated environment to manage, which almost creates the conditions where service providers are going to act in a way that kind of constrains people's autonomy. This has all been a very kind of negative characterization, but we've also done an awful lot of research with homelessness services which show how they can enable autonomy. And there are two key things from the literature. One is this idea, it's a very simple premise, although a simple premise that's not often realized, and that is when service providers look beyond people's homelessness or state of despair or addiction or problems and see them as humans beyond anything else. That kind of sense of seeing someone as a person rather than a client, rather than a homeless person, is seen to kind of enable people to feel good about themselves and express their autonomy. Also practicing with people in a way that resonates with their sense of self. We see this in street outreach, when street outreach workers can connect with people on the street, but not connecting with them in a way that's doing things to them, but working with them. We've also seen the importance in some homelessness services that have changed so that people can come in and access services, including accommodation, but they don't have to identify as a homeless person. It's a universal kind of a model where people come in and they can talk about what they need rather than assuming that what they need represents an identity. And this is kind of the positive kind of ways that services can work with people to promote autonomy. But there are, of course, other more profound ways, and that is we can change the way that we do things. We know that homelessness exists in Australia because of the lack of social and political will to progress it. But of course, COVID happened and we all of a sudden had the political will. This is a homelessness shelter in Brisbane that was closed down during COVID. It was closed down for the purposes of enabling people to practice social distancing. The government closed it down and threw an awful lot of money that they said before the pandemic we didn't have. And it rented out this beautiful student accommodation in a very prestigious suburb of Brisbane. This student accommodation has independent rooms with independent bathrooms and kitchenettes. People were all of a sudden able to exercise autonomy. No longer were they in shared dormitories, lining up for their food in shared toilets and bathrooms. Instead, they automatically had their own amenity. We can change the way that people who are homeless experience autonomy or dependence by changing the kind of resources that we provide to them. And COVID showed us that there was a great opportunity to do that. Very, very quickly, this is a super, super complicated figure, but what it shows is the demand for emergency relief. So emergency relief, when people present saying, I need a $20 voucher, I need food, I need clothes, the demand for emergency relief in Australia or in Queensland compared to how much the government corona supplement payment increased. As soon as the corona supplement increased and job seeker increased, the demand for emergency relief fell through the floor. Essentially, when we provided people with a livable income through Centrelink, people no longer needed to go and become dependent on charities. And what we can see here with the figures, although it's hard to discern, but just believe me, what we can see here, as the generosity of the corona payments reduced, people accordingly started to increase demand on emergency relief. Essentially, if we want to reduce dependence, we can provide people who are poor, people who are homeless, with a livable wage, and they can be independent. They can go and buy fruit and vegetables or whatever it is that they need to buy themselves. And very, very finally, what all of the research says, when people leave homelessness and into their own housing, here's an example of Brisbane Common Ground, a permanent supportive housing building in Brisbane. We've done research with lots and lots and lots of people who were homeless and now live in housing. And what we want to know is it home for you? Because we know that housing and home are not the same thing. So we want to know, are you experiencing a home? In this study, 91% of people said, yes, it is home. And we said, well, why? What's home about it? We thought we were going to get some very, very complicated, sophisticated kind of responses. And people said, there's the door. I can lock it when I want. There's the kettle. If I want a cuppa, I can turn it on when I want. There's the TV. I can change the channel when I want. Just home for people who, our research, who had exited homelessness and had their own secure supportive housing or social housing tenancy, was the resource that they needed to exercise control and autonomy over their lives. So I think this is the best way that we can promote that kind of sense of people being autonomous. And of course, what we know about living this autonomous life is the way that we can contribute toward or lead toward a meaningful life where people can choose what they want to do, whatever those choices are. I think I'll turn it over to you, Kate, and Chris and Amanda now, and I'll stop sharing.
So much, Cameron. And so now I'll invite Chris and Amanda. I'll just put a spotlight on you so that everyone can see you. And there we go. Hi to both of you. So Cameron's raised a whole lot of issues about how homeless services are delivered and the questions around autonomy and dependence. So I'm just wondering if you can each reflect on that. Maybe start with you, Chris. You've had your own experience of homelessness, but you've also done a lot of peer work in homelessness services. So I guess you've sort of seen it from both perspectives. Can you share what your experience has been around times when you felt like your autonomy was compromised in accessing services, but also share what you've observed working as a peer worker in terms of when people's autonomy was compromised, or when you felt like services were provided in a way that really was really positive for people's ability to control their environment.
Yeah, I'll speak about my own experience with accessing services. Because I was working and also a carer for my father, and had a daughter in tow, it became just ridiculous. I did even access the service. They wanted you to attend appointments at given times of the day, and I couldn't meet that requirement. They had no opportunity for phoning in or anything. So I really didn't have any outreach access, which would have been quite beneficial for me, because I did have to basically I wasn't able to access any services due to those constraints. So that was difficult. Also briefly, when I was at some stage homeless with my daughter, I was couch surfing, and that's where my autonomy was diminished quite a lot because I felt obliged to fit into another person's routine, stay out of their way, do chores for them because I felt like I needed to give back something. So often I'd find myself doing the dishes and the washing and hanging things up on the line and, you know, looking after her children when she wanted to work a little bit later. So that was all those things that were unspoken, but you just felt you needed to do those things in order to somehow feel like you're giving back and it's not just all being dependent on them. But that's pretty much dependency anyway without autonomy. And leading to that, there was at one stage I was doing a lot of surveys at a night cafe where people come in and sleep on the floor and get ham, cheese, tomatoes, toasties, maybe a cup of coffee. And as I was going there quite consistently, I saw how the place started to operate. The volunteers were friendly and got to know each person. Um, there's only usually 4 or 5 volunteers on each night. The mix of people was from elderly to young, various psychological sort of states. There's also the substance abuse people were there as well. And it was interesting to see the way that the community as a whole managed their safety in that kind of environment. There was this sort of unspoken, sort of understood thing that if you cause trouble inside this cafe, then the community will do something about it. Like they will say, hey, look, can you take it outside? Or they would say, hey, look, I don't feel safe. I'm going to ring the police. So they actually took control of their environment, also their sleeping positions. They, you know, once somebody had said, well, I slept here last night, it was a given that's where they'd sleep the next night, unless somebody hadn't shown up and there was a better spot. So there was a lot of self-control in that setup. And people expressed, when I was doing the surveys, the clients expressed a want to actually put back into the system to make it more comfortable for people. They wanted to be able to clean the surfaces of the tables. They wanted to be able to wash and sweep the floors. They wanted to be able to clean the showers and the toilets. So they always, a lot of them said, if only we were given those the equipment to do that, they would actually appreciate being able to do that. And it's not the first time I've heard people say, hey, look, this is what's wrong. We know you're overworked, but we can actually do something ourselves to, you know, keep this working. Like we can clean the shower, we can clean the toilet, we can manage our space, our mutual community space, if you just allowed us to. So I hope they did allow them to. I didn't get any feedback from the surveys, which is often the case with surveys. You never do know what's been acted upon or not, which is again another thing I could go on about. I'll hand it over to you again, Kate.
Thanks, Chris. I think that's really interesting about that space being seen as a shared space with control exercised not just by the volunteers but by people using the service as well. It's really interesting. Amanda, can I pass over to you? So you came into contact with homeless services as a teen, and then again as a pregnant mum. So they're quite different stages of life, really. Can you share with us what kind of care and ability to exercise autonomy you had each time, and perhaps how you felt like your relationship to that autonomy changed from being a teenager to growing up and interacting with services as an adult?
Yeah, thanks, Kate. It's definitely two experiences that were completely different. And I think by the time I was an adult, I was able to I was actually homeless a couple of times when I was an adult around that pregnancy time. But the time that we're talking about here, that was the last time. So I felt like I'd become a little bit of a pro at the whole thing, but I'm sure, there's a lot more that people out there that have got more experience than that. But anyway, it was very much doing it out on my own and not having any idea. But when I was older, I kind of knew what to do and where to go. And particularly when I was pregnant, I think just the survival mode came in full force, and I just did what I needed to do. But I didn't really know, what I was doing until afterwards. So it's quite difficult to explain. But yeah, a huge difference. When I was younger, I heavily relied upon the kindness of the workers that I was around, and quite a lot of that as an adult as well. So the kindness of the worker would make or break my day, because of that hypersensitivity to anything of, that resembles trauma. And kindness is just, it can also, it could also break me on the day as well if someone was really kind. And I was a young girl just rejected by mum, and whatever the reasons were, it could be quite sad as well. So I hope I'm making sense. But how does that sound, Kate? Did I answer the question?
No, really, that sounds really great. I'm just wondering, is it okay to talk a bit about the kind of like where the family situation that you went to when you're a teenager and what that experience was like?
Yeah, so it was pretty much in the first instance, I went to a girls' home, and I was taken away from the family home on a Sunday afternoon when I was hanging out the washing. So I really had no idea. Even though my mum buying me a suitcase for my 16th birthday should have been a bit of a hint, but it was quite dreadful. But the workers that I was involved in at that time, I think, just wanted me to be with family because I was only 16. So I just, kind of did what they suggested and went from the girls' home, which was a lovely, church-orientated family. I was there for a few weeks. I had to catch 4 buses to and from school. So they put me in a place that was closer to my school, which at the time was in Glen Waverley. And then I stayed until, halfway through the year, and then I left because it was all quite difficult. And then, I just bounced around from house to house from what the workers would give me. They'd give me, an address to go to, and off I'd go. And then that wouldn't work out, and then there'd be another address to go to, so off I'd go. So yeah, there was a lot of bouncing around until I basically found something on a uni board for share accommodation, and moved in that situation. And from then on, I was on my own. So that would have been about 17 and a half, 18. But yeah, very much, yeah.
Thanks, Amanda. And then I remember when we were talking before, you were telling us about the convent that you stayed in,
Yep.
and some of the rules and regulations kind of in that environment. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. So one of the requirements, well, first of all, when I was pregnant, I was kicked out of my ex-partner's house for a number of reasons, which were not very good. So I knew where to go and what to do, which is exactly what I did. I went from hotel to hotel, and then I had to go. Well, I was approved to stay with the convents for a few weeks while there was a place becoming available at Women's Refuge. So this convent that I stayed at, which was for about 3 weeks, the criteria to get in there was that you couldn't be affected by drugs or alcohol, and if you were a recovering addict, that you had to be well into recovery mode. So it was quite a genuinely peaceful place. There wasn't a lot of conflict, but with that there was dinner and prayers at 5 o'clock, reading time until 7, and then lights out at 8 o'clock, and you would have a nun come around and pop her little head in the door and say hello, good night, lights out. And that was it. I think at the time, because I was in the middle of my trimester and not sick, I was loving life. Everything was fine. So I had no violence and no issues around me. So I went with it, and I was quite happy. Which, looking back on it, was quite ironic, because I think if someone had done that to me, like now, if I was in that situation now, I'd probably tell them to stuff off. But anyway, that's what happened. And yeah, there was quite strict rules about curfew. No phone calls. Yeah, curfew, you had to be home by 5 o'clock every night. That was on the weekend. You weren't allowed out during the week. Yeah, you had to be at the dinner. You didn't have to partake in prayers, but it definitely, put on us. Like, yeah, I can't remember all of it, but yeah, quite different. And then after about 3 weeks, I went to Launch Housing East St Kilda and was with Women's Refuge. That was, women who were pregnant, women that were affected by drugs and alcohol, and a relatively medium-sized space. And I had my own unit, which came with a kitchenette and a bathroom, and that was pretty good. But I had to see pregnant women walking around on drugs and looking for drugs and things like that. So yeah, that was a bit challenging.
Thanks, Amanda. And I think it's really interesting listening to what you're saying, reflecting on when those controls are experienced as safety and when they're experienced as sort of coercion, and maybe sometimes they're experienced as both at the same time. So that's really interesting. And I think another thing that comes through, which I'll open up for, and people might like to ask questions or to explore these ideas more. But as we go through life, I think one of the things that's interesting to reflect on as teenagers is where control is experienced as safety and boundaries that are, similar to what a parent might provide. And sometimes having control to be able to do absolutely anything you want can exacerbate people's feelings of chaos. And where as an adult, you sort of grow out of wanting to have those kind of boundaries around you. So nothing is necessarily the same through the life course. Chris, I can see you nodding. Did you want to add in anything about that? Because you've again probably experienced homelessness at different times in your life, so maybe you had a different experience at different times.
Actually, no, but I will reflect on my mother's experience of being without a home at age 67. How she viewed what she perceived as the things that she absolutely needed was control over her environment and control over where she would be. And whenever she moved from place to place while she was couch surfing, it was always about, well, I will only be here if I'm allowed this, and I can have this and I can have that. She was exercising her rights more than, say, I would have been at age, how old was I? I think, yeah, I was 47 when I was homeless. So whereas my mum would express her needs and wants, as you can see, when I was at 47 with work, I didn't express my needs and wants as much. So yeah, that I think as you get older, you do want to sort of have more control over your situation than when you're younger. Yeah.
I think you get more confident.
Yeah.
Yeah, you don't really settle for well, just I know that I think that's what happened with me. You don't settle for people's you know, stuff. And you kind of have a way of saying, you know, no, I don't agree with that, and I'm not going to be treated like that.
Yeah. Yeah. Like when I was younger, I throughout my uni years, I was off and on homeless just because of the rental situations. And I'd often go to the Hare Krishna temple to get some food. And this is just bringing me back to that charity thing, where you have to, you'd have to basically sit through a full chanting Krishna thing, and be very humbled by Krishna and such before you could actually get your meal. So it was like a whole hour um, of Hare Krishna talk before you could actually enjoy their delicious food. But you know, I would not do that nowadays. Just
Yeah.
yeah. I wouldn't be doing that now. But back then it was like, oh well, you know, just go through with it just to get that food into your belly.
Yeah.
Yeah. But now I wouldn't do that. I'd rather go to a food pantry and, you know, see what I could do there.
Interesting.
Mm.
I've never been to one.
Oh,
I think I was too scared. I think, yeah, I think when I was young, when I was a teenager, I never went. But yeah,
well, they are very cultish like. I
yeah,
hope there's no Krishnas here with us today, but
it
it's
can
just
be, yeah,
it's very much very forced upon you whenever you use their services. Right down to the point where you've got to take your shoes off and leave them at certain doorways. And even when you go visit, like I had to visit one to hand out brochures for street count, I had to, you know, first do a little prayer, take my shoes off, do a little prayer, one of their prayers, speak to the receptionist, and then sort of very politely ask if they wouldn't mind putting this brochure up about the street count. So even just going in to hand a flyer was very yeah, organized sort of propaganda for the Krishna I don't know if they call themselves a church. I don't think so. Temple, anyway. Yeah,
yeah, temple.
temple. Hmm.
Thanks for that. I'm just wondering, I'll open up now to the whole audience. So if you would like to share something or ask a question, if you go to the reactions button at the bottom and you click on that, you can, there's a raise hand thing, and then I'll be able to see that you'd like to speak. Deb, over to you.
So this is the question for you, Cameron, because you've done all that research, and thank you, Homelessness Australia, for running this. I guess, really asking the question around how would we change the structure of our service system to ensure that we don't have all of these rules and that we can provide people with autonomy. Because when we look at housing first practices, that's critical to getting good results. But we've got this service system that's just decades in the making. That's the wrong way around, which is if you want our service, you need to tick all these boxes and you need to fit into this. So what is the one thing that we can do to start to change that structural process that's embedded in both the way governments are contracting to services and the way services are delivered? Thank you.
Gosh, I wish I had an answer that was equally good as the question. There are so many dimensions to it, and as you've said, we've got path dependencies. We have all of these services now, and it doesn't matter what happens tomorrow or even next year. They're still going to be there, so we're kind of stuck with them for the medium term. What I think we have to do is, one, recognize lots of the constraints to autonomy happen now because we've got people sharing bathrooms and kitchens and sometimes dormitories. So some of it's almost forced. It's not the problem of the workers as such. It would almost be impossible for them to do otherwise. So I think we have to, acknowledge that the built environment we're operating in is so problematic that what we need to do is be investing in the affordable forms of housing that give people the autonomy. But that's kind of a lot of people criticize me as being too utopic when I say things like that, and I take it as a compliment, although it's not intended to be one. I think what we could do straight away, though, Deb, and it perhaps goes back to some of the things that Chris and Amanda said. We can start seeing people homeless as people and not as deficient and inadequate and as to blame for their homelessness. And we can start thinking about when we're trying to work with them, whose needs we're meeting. And I think some of the examples of you need to sit in front of a sermon or you need to do what's best for our organisation, be it secular or faith, suggests that many people are focused on the interests and the benefits of the service provider, or even when they're focused on the person who's homeless, the service provider is assuming they know what they need in terms of you need to come to God or to Krishna, or you need to live in a certain kind of way. So I think what we need to do is, beyond anything else, respect people as homeless as capacities. But I think Kate made a really brilliant point. It's so complicated, and that is, the extent to which we want or will benefit from autonomy changes throughout our lives. And, for some people, including myself, 1 week will be different from the next. But what we want is we want people to be able to have access to the resources whereby those varying levels of autonomy and control that they can exercise is not determined because they're, deprived of a place to live. We want the constraints and the changes to autonomy and control to be driven by what the individual needs rather than that's just what we have to do because they're saying in this dormitory.
Thanks, Cameron. Thanks, Dan. And Judy, over to you. Just unmute and off you go.
Can you hear me now? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Cameron and everyone, because I was going yes, yes, yes as you were speaking. But an interesting point came up for me. I am actually 82 years of age. I'm still pretty independent. I've always been an independent person, but I'm starting to realise that speaking up for yourself doesn't necessarily help. I was at one stage given a case manager. The case manager, after I'd had him for a couple of months, I was offered one case. I refused it because my refrigerator didn't fit, my washing machine didn't fit, plus a few other things. Shortly after this, I got a call from him saying he was taking me off his list as he felt I was perfectly capable of advocating for myself, which I am in lots of ways. But he would reinstate me if something really changed. About 4 months ago, I rang up to see where I was actually on the list. I'm on a 10 years waiting list, which means I'll be 92 by the time I actually get something. So I asked to be reinstated, which didn't happen. I also had a conversation with a worker who told me, pointed out to me, you've already refused one property, one more refusal and you're out. It's like you do as you're told, and then you will have, we might be able to help you. I'm realising I'm probably more likely to get some help if I play the victim rather than standing up for my rights as a person. I was also interested to see I subscribe to a number of things to different interests, that the editorial in the Lancet Medical Journal this week had an excellent editorial called Housing, an Overlooked Social Determinant of Health, which is actually what they're saying. And this is so true, because I can feel the more I'm in this situation, and I have had some accommodation, I've been out of it, I've spent $10,000 having things in storage, but I can feel my mental health and my physical health being affected. I'm very fortunate to have had good friends, but as I think Chris was pointing out, there are a lot of constraints there. I don't want to take up too much time, but thank you. Thank you for what you're doing.
Thanks, Judy. Lots of really important points there. It's really that story that you tell about being sort of really pressured to take offers of accommodation is very familiar. Any other questions? I wonder, while I'm waiting for someone else to ask a question, don't be shy, everyone. I'm really interested in that question in communal environments, about balancing the need for safety with the need for people's autonomy. So often people will report that they feel unsafe in environments, and I think we heard that from you, Amanda, in environments, if people are using drugs, if you're yourself not a drug user, and also, but at the same time, you know, if that's where people are at in their life, then it's really challenging, you know, then telling them that they're not allowed to use drugs is, you know, exerting control over that autonomy for them. So I just wonder, Chris, if you can reflect on that a little bit more, because I know you mentioned that in the environment at the night cafe, some of that behaviour was regulated by service user to service user, which I think is really interesting, and a shift in the power dynamic. So it's not just all the volunteers or staff telling service users what they can and can't do, but people managing those tensions as a community of people having a shared experience. Would you be able to say a little bit more about that?
Unmute, that's good. Well, there was a lot of drinking and drug use outside, just outside in the laneway, but it wasn't allowed in, and people wouldn't let, the general community wouldn't let anybody in if they had a drink in their hand. So often what would happen is if somebody was drinking, they'd have drinking buddies, and somebody would look after their alcohol while the other person goes in and gets the sandwich or 2 toasties or something, and they end up back in the alleyway with their toasties. But it was a given that if there was too much trouble from anyone, if they started disturbing people who were trying to have a rest, that they'd just be told off, like, get out of here, leave us alone, we're trying to sleep. And it was just an understood thing. And they did coexist together because, you know, there were some people who'd just come out for a smoke and they'd be out there with the people who are on substances. And there was also a bit of blacklisting that went on as well from the volunteers. So if you did disrupt the place too often, then you would be blacklisted, and then the police would be called upon. So but it took 3 strikes, you're out kind of a deal, or 4 strikes, and depending on how your behaviour was, and to what extent was it disruptive for everyone else, it would depend on how you would be allowed back in. And it was funny because often on payday was when you saw most of the people out in the alleyways enjoying a drink, and often you wouldn't even see them come in because they're all out at local pubs or booze spots spending their money on it. But that it was regulated mainly by the community inside. It's and the volunteers would back them up if a phone call needed to be made, so be it. Yeah. And you know, there were some issues with abuse and conflict. There's also, you know, overdosing that occurs. So there's always, the staff are always aware of keeping an eye on the people who were outside, just in case something would go wrong, and then they'd be able to either call the police or the ambulance if it did get to that, reach that point. But I felt totally safe there on all occasions. So yeah, it was a pretty relaxing environment all in all.
Thanks, Chris. Well, it's pretty much we've come to the end. So thank you so much for everyone for participating. Thanks to Cameron for your work and for sharing it today. And thanks to Amanda and Chris for those fabulous reflections. I think that certainly enabled me to have a deeper understanding of the topic, hearing you talk about it. And thanks so much to Council to Homeless Persons for partnering with us on this event. And all right, thanks everyone. We'll finish now.
Okay, thank you, everyone.
Excellent. Thanks, Kate. Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Amanda. Thanks, everyone.
Lovely
Bye
to
now.
meet you.
Thank you, Cameron.
Cameron, lovely to meet you.
Nice to meet you, Amanda. Bye now.